Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. The lighthouse at Widow's Point. The first time I saw the ship, I thought it was a hallucination. 3 weeks alone in a lighthouse will do that to you. Especially this lighthouse, Widow's Point, they call it, standing sentinel over the most treacherous stretch of coastline in Nova Scotia. I'd taken the job because I needed to disappear for a while. My life had fallen apart in spectacular fashion: divorce, drinking, debt. The lighthouse keeper position seemed perfect: 3 months of solitude, decent pay, and absolutely no one to bother me. The previous keeper had left suddenly, citing personal reasons. The Maritime Authority was desperate enough to hire me without asking too many questions about the 6-month gap in my employment history. Just keep the light on, log the weather, and report any distress signals, Captain Hargrove had said during my brief orientation. The supply boat comes every 2 weeks. Otherwise, you're on your own. He'd paused then, studying me with narrowed eyes. One more thing, McIntyre, the locals have stories about this place. Ignore them, it's just a lighthouse. I'd nodded, not particularly interested in local folklore. But as Hargrove's boat pulled away, leaving me alone with the towering white structure, I'd felt a peculiar sensation, as if the lighthouse itself was watching me. That was 23 days ago. The ship appeared on the 24th night, during a storm that had been building since morning. I was in the lantern room, making sure the light was functioning properly. Rain lashed against the glass, and visibility was near zero despite the powerful beam cutting through the darkness. Then lightning flashed, illuminating the churning sea below, and there it was. A massive wooden vessel with tall masts and billowing sails that should have been shredded by the gale-force winds. It looked like something from another century, yet it cut through the 30-foot waves with impossible grace. I grabbed my binoculars, hands shaking. The ship was heading straight for the jagged rocks that had claimed countless vessels over the years. I rushed to the radio, broadcasting an urgent warning. Unidentified sailing vessel approaching Widow's Point. You are on collision course with the rocks. Alter your heading immediately. Over. Nothing but static answered me. I tried again, more frantically this time. Vessel approaching lighthouse, do you copy? You're in extreme danger. The storm swallowed my words. I watched helplessly as the ship continued its suicidal course. Then, just as it should have smashed into the rocks, another lightning flash revealed nothing. The ship was gone. I spent the rest of the night convincing myself I'd seen a ghost ship, a reflection on the glass perhaps, or a trick of the lightning and exhaustion. By morning, as weak sunlight filtered through the clouds, I'd almost succeeded. Almost. The logbook changed everything. I found it while searching for a maintenance manual in the small office adjacent to my living quarters. The book was old, its leather cover cracked and faded, wedged behind a filing cabinet as if someone had tried to hide it. Inside were the daily logs of lighthouse keepers going back nearly 100 years. Most entries were mundane: weather reports, maintenance notes, supply inventories. But as I flipped through the yellowed pages, certain entries caught my attention. April 17, 1923, spotted sailing vessel during storm. Vessel disappeared when approaching rocks, no wreckage found. November 3, 1937, ship sighted tonight, old-fashioned schooner, impossible in this weather, gone by morning. February 28, 1954, the mariner has returned. God help me. The entries grew more disturbing as I read on. October 12, 1967, they're watching from the water now. I can see their faces. January 5, 1978, the voices are coming from the basement. I will not go down there again. March 20, 1989, it's in the lighthouse with me. The final entry was dated just 2 months ago, written by my predecessor. I hear them scratching at the door at night. They want to come in. They say they're cold and wet and need shelter, but I've seen what they really are. I'm leaving tomorrow. May God forgive me for abandoning my post, but I cannot stay another night. I closed the book, my hands trembling. A rational explanation existed, of course. Isolation plays tricks on the mind. Lighthouse keepers were known for their superstitions. These were just the ramblings of lonely men, their sanity eroded by solitude and the constant roar of the sea. But that night I heard the scratching. It started around 2 a.m., barely audible beneath the sound of rain against the windows. A light, persistent scraping at the heavy oak door that separated the lighthouse from the small attached living quarters. I froze in my bed listening. It could be anything: a branch blown by the wind, a piece of loose metal, maybe even an animal seeking shelter. The rational explanations lined up in my mind like obedient soldiers. Then came the voice. Please let us in. The words were soft, almost childlike, but distorted as if spoken underwater. We're so cold out here. I sat upright, heart hammering against my ribs. Who's there? My voice sounded pathetically small. We're lost, came the reply, now seeming to come from multiple voices speaking in unison. Our ship, please help us. I reached for my phone to call the Coast Guard, but the screen showed no signal, not unusual during storms. The landline was in the office on the other side of that door. Go to the village, I called out. It's only 5 miles down the coast. A pause, then. We can't leave. We belong here. With you, the scratching intensified, becoming a frantic scrabbling against the wood. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside my bed and approached the door cautiously. Through the small window, I could see only darkness and rain. I'm armed, I warned, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Identify yourselves now or I'm calling the authorities. The scratching stopped abruptly. Silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly a face pressed against the glass, pale and bloated, with milky dead eyes and blue lips pulled back in a rictus grin. Water streamed from its hair and mouth. Behind it I could make out more figures, similarly waterlogged and still. I stumbled backward, dropping the bat. The face continued to stare, unblinking, then slowly dragged one blue-tinged finger across the glass, leaving a trail of seawater that spelled out, "Let us in." I fled to the furthest corner of my bedroom, barricading the door with a dresser. Throughout the night, the scratching continued, occasionally interrupted by those terrible pleading voices. By dawn, they were gone, and I convinced myself it had been a nightmare, stress-induced hallucinations brought on by reading those disturbing logbook entries. The supply boat was due the next day. I would report the incident, request an immediate replacement, and leave this godforsaken place behind. But the supply boat never came. The storm had intensified overnight, waves now crashing halfway up the lighthouse. No boat could safely approach in these conditions. I tried the radio again, but received only static. My cell phone remained without signal. I was trapped. That afternoon, I forced myself to inspect the outer door. There were no scratch marks, no evidence of visitors in the night. Relief flooded through me. It had been a nightmare after all. But as I turned to go back inside, something caught my eye on the rocky shore below. Wreckage. Pieces of wooden planking, torn sails, and what looked like a ship's figurehead. A woman with outstretched arms, her wooden face frozen in a silent scream. The storm must have driven a vessel onto the rocks despite my warning light. I had to check for survivors. The narrow path down to the shore was treacherous in good weather. In the storm, it was nearly suicidal. But my conscience wouldn't let me ignore the possibility of people dying on those rocks. I put on my raincoat and boots and began the precarious descent. The wind tried to tear me from the cliff face with each step. By the time I reached the shore, I was soaked through despite my waterproof gear. The wreckage was scattered across the rocks, some pieces still being tossed by the violent surf. I searched for an hour, finding only debris, all of it strangely aged, as if the ship had sunk decades ago rather than last night. No bodies, no survivors. Just as I was about to give up and climb back to the lighthouse, I spotted something half buried in the sand. A small wooden chest, its metal fittings green with corrosion. Curiosity overcame my better judgment. I dug it out and managed to force the rotted lock open. Inside was a ship's log, preserved in oilskin, and a pocket watch stopped at 3:17. The log belonged to the merchant vessel Annabelle Lee, dated 1887. The final entry read, "Nav 4 lighthouse in sight, but no light burns. Fear treachery. May God have mercy on our souls." I dropped the log as if it had burned me. The Annabelle Lee had sunk 135 years ago because the light had failed or been deliberately extinguished, but that was impossible. The ship I'd seen last night couldn't be the same vessel, unless... I looked up at the lighthouse towering above me. Had the light been on last night, I'd been in the lantern room, ensuring it was working properly. But what if it had failed after I'd gone to bed? What if I was somehow responsible for the shipwreck? A wave larger than the others crashed against the rocks, nearly sweeping me away. As the water receded, I saw them, footprints in the wet sand, leading from the sea toward the path up to the lighthouse. Dozens of sets appearing from nowhere as if their owners had walked out of the ocean itself, and they were fresh. I ran back to the path, scrambling upward with reckless speed. Twice I nearly fell, saved only by desperately grabbing at rock outcroppings. By the time I reached the top, my hands were bloody and my lungs burning. I burst through the door of the lighthouse, slamming it behind me and throwing the heavy bolt into place. Safe, I was safe. Then I saw the puddles of seawater on the floor, trailing up the spiral staircase that led to the lantern room. Something was in the lighthouse with me. I stood frozen, listening. The building creaked and groaned as it always did in storms, but underneath those familiar sounds was something else, a soft, wet shuffling from somewhere above. I needed a weapon. The baseball bat was still in my bedroom, and I had a flare gun in the office. But to reach either, I'd have to move toward those stairs and whatever waited above. The decision was made for me when the light went out. The sudden darkness was absolute. Even the dim emergency lights failed to activate. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak flashlight to illuminate the space around me. The beam caught something at the top of the stairs, a pale hand gripping the railing, water dripping from blue-tinged fingers. I ran for the office, slamming and locking the door behind me. The flare gun was in the desk drawer. I grabbed it with shaking hands, loading a cartridge as something heavy thudded against the door. "You let us die," came that terrible chorus of voices, no longer pleading but accusatory. "You extinguished the light, that wasn't me," I shouted. "That was 135 years ago. Time means nothing to the drowned," they replied. "We have waited so long for a keeper to pay the debt." The door shuddered under their assault. Wood splintered around the hinges, they would be through in moments. I aimed the flare gun at the door, hands trembling. "Stay back, I'll shoot." The pounding stopped. Silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then a voice different from the others, deeper and somehow more present, spoke directly beside my ear. "The debt must be paid, keeper." I whirled around, firing the flare gun instinctively. The phosphorus round illuminated the office in blinding red light, and the dozen or more figures surrounding me. Their waterlogged bodies were in various states of decay, clothes rotted and hanging in tatters. Their eyes were uniformly milk-white, their skin the gray-blue of the long-drowned. At their center stood a tall figure in a captain's uniform, his beard still perfectly trimmed despite the seaweed tangled in it. He reached for me with hands that had become little more than bone. "The light," he rasped. "You must maintain the light." The flare sputtered out, plunging us back into darkness. I felt cold, wet hands grabbing me from all sides, dragging me toward the door and up the spiral staircase. I fought wildly, but there were too many of them, their grip supernaturally strong despite their decayed state. They pulled me up to the lantern room, where the massive Fresnel lens stood dark for the first time in decades. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could see lights on the horizon, ships that would soon meet the same fate as the Annabelle Lie if the light remained extinguished. "Fix it," the captain commanded, his dead eyes fixed on mine. "Save them as you failed to save us." I looked at the mechanical components of the light. The main power switch had been turned off and several crucial wires disconnected. Working frantically under the gaze of the drowned crew, I reconnected everything and threw the switch. Nothing happened. "It needs more power," I explained desperately. "The storm must have affected the generators." The captain's expression didn't change. "Then give it power." One of the crew handed him a knife, an ancient, barnacle-encrusted blade that looked as if it had spent a century on the ocean floor. The captain took my hand in his cold grip, and before I could resist, drew the blade across my palm. Blood welled from the cut, surprisingly bright in the dim emergency lighting. The captain pressed my bleeding hand against the base of the light mechanism. "Blood has power," he intoned. "Life has power." To my horror, the light began to glow, weakly at first, then with increasing brightness until the powerful beam once again swept across the turbulent waters. The ships on the horizon adjusted their course, moving away from the treacherous rocks. The drowned crew watched in silence as the vessels sailed to safety. Then one by one they began to dissolve, not disappearing instantly, but slowly breaking apart like sand sculptures in rising tide, returning to the sea from which they'd emerged. Only the captain remained, his form more solid than the others had been. He turned to me, and for a moment I thought I saw something like gratitude in those milky eyes. "The debt is paid," he said. "But the light must never go out again." Then he too dissolved, leaving me alone in the lantern room with only a blood-stained light mechanism as evidence of what had transpired. The storm broke the next morning. The supply boat arrived around noon, its captain apologizing for the delay. I said nothing about my visitors, knowing how it would sound. Instead, I asked about the history of the lighthouse. "Oh, there's plenty of stories," the boat captain said as he unloaded my supplies. "Worst one was back in 1887. Whole ship went down with all hands because the keeper let the light go out. They say he did it on purpose, went mad from isolation and wanted company in his misery." "What happened to him?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "Found him dead in the lantern room, no marks on him but his face. They say his face was frozen in a scream, like he'd seen something terrible." The captain shrugged. "Just stories, though." I nodded, absently touching the bandage on my palm. "Just stories." That night I checked the light mechanism a dozen times, ensuring everything was in perfect working order. As I was about to leave the lantern room, I noticed something carved into the metal base of the structure, something I was certain hadn't been there before. "We are always watching. I've been at Widow's Point Lighthouse for 6 months now. I requested an extension of my contract, much to the surprise of the Maritime Authority. The isolation doesn't bother me anymore. In fact, I find comfort in the routine, maintaining the light, logging the weather, watching the ships pass safely in the night. Sometimes, when storms rage against the lighthouse, I think I hear scratching at the door and voices calling from below. On those nights, I climb to the lantern room and check the light with obsessive care, my bandaged hand throbbing with remembered pain. The ships on the horizon depend on me. The dead beneath the waves are counting on me. And so I remain at my post, a faithful keeper of the light. After all, I've seen what happens when the light goes out at Widow's Point.